Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. And today we're going to be doing something pretty interesting. We're
Yeah.
going to be talking about variations in the English language.
Right.
And specifically, we're going to be looking at American, British, and Canadian English.
Uh-huh.
And using as our source some excerpts from the Master English podcast,
Yeah.
which kind of goes into all those different
Yeah.
areas of the English language. So this should be pretty fun.
Yeah. I'm excited about this one.
Yeah, it's going to be cool.
I love talking about differences in language
Yeah.
and how they came about, and just all the little nuances.
Yeah, and I think it'll help people be more aware of just the global kind of nature of English,
Right.
that it's not just one thing.
Exactly.
It's spoken all over the place.
And you know what? Even for native speakers,
Yeah.
I think a lot of native speakers kind of assume that everybody speaks English the same way they do.
Right.
And so it's eye-opening sometimes to learn about, these variations.
So should we just jump right into it?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so I guess the first thing is vocabulary, right?
All right.
So, we might think that the words we use are the same everywhere, but there's some real differences.
Uh-huh.
For instance, if I'm in America or in Canada and I live in an apartment,
Yeah.
if I go over to the UK,
Right.
they're going to call that a flat.
Right.
It's the same thing, but it's a totally different word.
Exactly. And,
Yeah.
I think that's what makes it so fascinating,
Yeah.
is that you have these little subtle differences
Right.
that really sort of open a window into,
Yeah.
different cultures and how
Yeah.
they approach the world.
And it's kind of fun, like when you think about it.
Yeah.
It's like, why is that?
Right.
You know?
That's the history there.
Yeah, what's the history behind that? Like, why do they call it this and we call it this?
Exactly.
Another one is transportation.
Yeah.
So, like, in America, if you're taking, an underground train,
Yeah.
you're going to call that the subway.
Mhm.
But if you go over to the UK,
Yeah.
it's either going to be the underground or the tube.
Right. Right.
It's the same thing, but it's just a different word for it.
And again, it's reflective of just the way that, those systems developed in different places.
Yeah.
They have their own unique histories, and those histories are kind of embedded in the language.
Yeah, and then the example they use in the podcast is food.
Right.
Which is really interesting.
Yeah.
So, if you want some fried potatoes,
Yeah.
if you're in America or Canada, you're going to call those fries.
Fries. Right.
But if you go to the UK,
Yeah.
they're going to call those chips.
Chips. Exactly.
And what's interesting is in Canada, they do say fries,
Yeah.
but they have a very famous dish called poutine,
Yes.
which is fries with cheese curds and gravy on it.
Yeah, so it's like a whole different cultural,
Right.
take on it.
Yeah, so even though they share that word, they have sort of a different...
Right. It's like they took it and ran with it in a totally different direction.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah, and so it's interesting to think about like how the development of the language reflects those sort of cultural culinary differences.
And I think that's a great example
Yeah.
of how these seemingly small differences in vocabulary can actually point to, bigger cultural differences.
Scott, for sure.
And different histories and different ways of life.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's really fascinating
Yeah, it is.
when you start to dig into it.
Yeah. So the next thing we wanted to talk about was spelling.
Spelling, yeah.
So we all know, I think, that British and American English have some different spellings.
Right.
And it's interesting to see how, like, some of those developed.
Yeah.
So, for instance, words that end in British English,
Uh-huh.
like color or favor.
Right.
In American English, it's just art.
Great. Color favor.
Color favor.
Yeah. And a lot of that is due to Noah Webster,
Right.
who back in the 19th century
Right.
was really trying to streamline American English spelling.
Right.
And he had this idea that
Yeah.
American English should be its own distinct thing.
Right.
And he felt that simplifying the spelling was one way to do that.
Yeah. And he also simplified some other words as well, like,
Right.
changing some of the resses to airs.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Like center to center,
Yeah.
things like that.
Yeah. So that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Another spelling difference is the allies ending.
Yeah.
So in British English, they tend to use allies a lot.
Right. So like organize, realize.
Right. And in American English, they tend to use alias.
Right. Organize, realize.
And what about Canada?
So Canada's interesting because they actually use both.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So you'll see both allies and aliases in Canadian English.
Oh.
But there is a slight preference for allied eyes.
Right.
Probably because of the, close proximity to the U.S.
Right, right.
and the influence of American English.
Yeah, so they're kind of a mix of the two.
Exactly. Yeah, they're kind of in between.
Okay.
And then another interesting one is double consonants. So like the word travel.
Right.
If you're adding a-ing in British or Canadian English, you usually double the L. So it's traveling.
Right.
But in American English, it's just traveling with one L.
Right.
So you see these little differences.
Yeah, and so even in spelling, which seems like it should be pretty straightforward.
Yeah, you would think.
You get these regional differences.
Absolutely. And it just goes to show you that, language isn't static.
Right.
It's constantly evolving.
Yeah.
And these spelling conventions become kind of markers of regional identity.
Yeah, and it's interesting, like, when you see a piece of writing and it has British spellings, you kind of know where it's from.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It gives you a clue about the origin of the text.
Okay, so let's move on to pronunciation.
Pronunciation, yeah.
So that's where things can get really interesting.
It can get really tricky.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you have so many different accents.
Right.
Even within small geographical areas.
Right.
But there's some general differences
Right.
between, American, British, and Canadian English
Okay.
that are worth noting.
Okay, so what are some of those?
Well, one of the classic ones is what we call rhoticity.
Rhoticity.
Rhoticity, yeah. And that's whether or not you pronounce the R
Okay.
at the end of words like car or hard.
Okay.
So American and Canadian English are generally rhotic,
Okay.
which means you do pronounce the R.
Right.
But a lot of British accents, particularly in southern England, are non-rhotic. So the R is often dropped.
Right.
Unless the next word starts with a vowel.
So you wouldn't say car, you'd say ka.
Exactly. Yeah, ka.
Okay.
And what's interesting is that historically, most English dialects were rhotic.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So the loss of the R in certain British dialects is actually a later development.
Huh. So it used to be that everybody pronounced the R?
Yeah, pretty much.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's rhoticity.
Rhoticity, yeah.
What else is there?
Well, there are also differences in vowel sounds.
Okay.
So one well-known example is the way Canadians pronounce about.
Right.
Sometimes it sounds more like a boot.
Yeah, a boot.
Yeah, and that's often called Canadian raising.
Right.
And it's quite distinct from the vowel sound you would hear in American or British English.
Right.
Yeah. And that's because, the vowel sound is being raised before certain consonants, like DTK.
Okay.
So it's a very specific phonetic phenomenon.
Right.
But it's one that a lot of people has noticed and commented on.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's interesting because it's one of those things that can really mark someone as being Canadian.
Yeah.
Just that one little vowel sound could be a giveaway.
Totally.
And then another interesting one is how certain consonant sounds are treated.
Okay.
So, for example, the T sound in a word like butter.
Right.
In American English, it often gets softened.
Right. So it sounds more like butter.
Yeah, butter, exactly.
Okay.
And British English tends to keep that T sound a little bit clearer. And Canada, as we've seen with other things, can kind of go either way.
Right.
So you might find some regions where they soften the T and other regions where they keep it more like a T.
Right.
So it's not always consistent.
Yeah, and so it's interesting how these little pronunciation differences can sometimes cause a little bit of confusion.
Right.
Like if you're in a restaurant and you ask for butter.
Yeah.
And they're expecting you to say butter.
Yeah. And they look at you funny.
Yeah.
But I think it also adds to the richness of the language.
Yeah, definitely.
That's what makes it so interesting.
Right.
To listen to different dialects.
Okay, so the last thing we wanted to talk about was grammar.
Grammar, yeah.
So we've talked about vocabulary, we've talked about spelling, we've talked about pronunciation.
Right.
But grammar is also something where you see some regional variation.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it's not just about the words themselves.
Right.
It's about how you put them together.
Right.
Into sentences.
Yeah.
So one example of this is the use of collective nouns.
Okay.
So in British English, you might hear sentences like, the team are winning.
Okay.
Where you're using a plural verb.
Right.
Even though team is singular.
Okay.
And the thinking there is that you're really focusing on the individual members of the team.
Right.
But in American and Canadian English, you would usually say the team is winning.
Right.
So you treat the collective noun as singular.
Right. So that's a subtle but important difference.
Yeah. And it's one of those things that you might not even notice unless you're really paying attention.
Yeah, but once you start noticing it,
Yeah.
you start hearing it everywhere.
Exactly.
Another one is prepositions.
Prepositions.
Those little words like at, on, in.
Right.
So for example, in the UK, it's common to say at the weekend.
Uh-huh.
But in the US and Canada, it's usually on the weekend.
Right, exactly.
So it's just a small difference.
Yeah.
But it's consistent.
Yeah.
And then even something as basic as past tense verbs can vary.
Uh-huh.
So the past tense of learn in British English is often learnt.
Learnt. Yeah.
But in American and Canadian English, it's learned.
Right.
So again, just a small difference, but it's something that can sort of trip you up.
Right.
If you're not expecting it.
Exactly. And all of these examples really highlight the fact that English grammar is not monolithic.
Right.
You know, there are these regional variations that reflect the fact that the language is constantly evolving.
Yeah. And changing.
And adapting to different contexts.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about vocabulary, spelling, pronunciation, and grammar. But what's really important to remember is that language doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Right.
It's influenced by culture and by history.
Absolutely.
And so, you know, a lot of these variations are a direct result of those influences.
I think that's a key takeaway for anyone who's interested in language.
Yeah.
Is that you can't really separate language from culture and history.
Right.
They're all interconnected.
So do you have any specific examples of how that plays out? Well,
one example is the influence of media.
Okay.
So like British TV shows, for example.
Right.
You know, shows like Peppa Pig or Downton Abbey have introduced a lot of British terms to American audiences.
Right.
Words like gobsmacked or cheeky. You might hear those words being used more and more in American English. Yeah.
Just because people have been exposed to them through these TV shows.
Yeah.
So that's an example of how you know, cultural exchange can directly impact language.
And that's something that's happening all the time.
All the time. Yeah. You know, as we get more and more globalized, these kinds of exchanges are happening more and more frequently.
Right.
And then another example is Canada.
Canada, right.
Which we've talked about a little bit already.
Yeah.
But Canada's linguistic landscape is really interesting because it's this blend of British and American English.
Right.
You know, because of Canada's history.
Right.
You know, with British colonization and then close proximity to the U.S.
Yeah.
They've kind of developed this unique linguistic situation where they have elements of both.
Yeah, it's almost like a hybrid.
Yeah, it's a hybrid.
Of the two.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, I mean, all of this just goes to show you that, you know, understanding the cultural influences really gives you a deeper understanding of why languages vary the way they do.
Yeah. And it makes it more interesting.
Oh, absolutely.
To study it.
Yeah.
You know, because it's not just about the words themselves. It's about the people and the history.
It's about the stories behind the word.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
So I guess to wrap things up, we've done a pretty thorough deep dive here.
I think so.
Into these variations in English.
Yeah.
And we've seen how, you know, vocabulary, spelling, pronunciation, grammar, and even everyday usage can differ across these regions.
Right. And I think the key takeaway is that these differences are not random.
Right.
You know, they're shaped by history.
Yeah.
By culture.
Yeah.
By the ongoing evolution of language.
Yeah.
So it's really fascinating.
Yeah. And so even though these differences can sometimes cause a little bit of confusion or, you know, make us pause and think for a second, ultimately they just make English a much richer, much more vibrant language.
It's a testament to the dynamism of the language.
Yeah.
You know, how it can adapt and change to fit different contexts.
Okay, so to end things on a more provocative note, what do you think the future holds?
Ooh. That's a good question.
For these different versions of English.
Well, you know, with the world becoming more and more interconnected through things like global media and online communication, I think it's an open question.
Yeah.
You know, will we see these different versions of English sort of start to converge and become more similar?
Right.
Or will they continue to diverge
and
become even more distinct?
And what would cause them to do one or the other?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
You know, I think it depends on a lot of factors. Things like migration patterns,
Right.
Language education policies, the influence of technology.
Right.
All of these things could play a role.
And it's fascinating to think about because, English is already such a global language.
It's a global language.
Yeah.
It's spoken by more people as a second language than as a first language.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's really become the language of international communication.
Yeah.
So, what happens to these different varieties is a question that has implications for everyone.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So I think it's something that we all need to be thinking about.
Yeah, definitely.
And paying attention to.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have for today.
Okay.
But this was a really interesting conversation.
It was.
I enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too.
And hopefully everyone listening got something out of it.
I hope so.
And, gives you something to think about.
Yeah, for sure.
So thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next time.
See you later.